Good morning and welcome to a special meeting of the Cobb County School Board. This is our whole governance training. We are required under statute to have continuing education as elected board members, and so this is the time we take to make sure that we are getting in our hours. And we have a special guest to come in today. Ms. Zinda Bowie from the Georgia School Boards Association will be conducting the training. We'd like to welcome her and turn the meeting over to Ms. Bowie. Thank you so much for coming.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here. As the chairman has said, this is whole board governance team training as required by law. And so we have 3 hours of training this morning. At the end of that time, I will give you a form from the Department of Education, ask each board member to sign to the far right of your name. If any of the information included on the form is inaccurate, would ask you to just do a strike through and make the correction, because this is the information that Georgia School Boards Association has on file for you. And that's the way we get in touch with you. So first, I want to offer you thanks for the invitation to come to Cobb County, spend some time with you. Recognizing that school boards are required to participate in whole board governance training every year, I know that you have choices. There are other vendors who are approved to provide this training, and it's not only the vendor, but the individual trainers have to be approved by the state as well. So I thank you for the invitation and for selecting Georgia School Boards Association to do this. But before we begin, I do want to remind you that GSBA is your membership organization. Okay. As a member of the state association, you have the opportunity to take advantage of what GSBA has to offer, including the development of legislative priorities. Some of you did attend the summer conference in Savannah recently. Is that correct? Okay. All right. So at that time, the priorities were discussed and voted upon. And I mention that because it's important that you as a school board are aware of your opportunity to present legislative priorities through GSBA. And I hope you will take advantage of that, because those are the things that we then take to the state capitol to ask our legislators to endorse on behalf of school boards all around the state. So I'm just mentioning that because the individualization of school boards is sometimes problematic. You are a member of, you know which district you're in for GSBA? Okay, y'all can talk to me. Do you know? No, it's the 7th. And I'm glad to know that I need to say a little bit of something about that. You are in District 7, and I would encourage you to check it and make sure that you know who your district representative is to the board of directors. That is the person with whom you can be in contact to make sure that GSBA is aware of any concerns, any recommendations you have. It is also an opportunity for you to interact with other board members around the state. Are you, as board members, aware of the GSBA Hub? Okay. That is the social network for school board members, and it gives you an opportunity to interact with others around the state at no cost. You don't have to incur travel, etc. So I would ask you to take advantage of that, and I will check in my bag and see if I brought you the information about the hub. If I did not, we'll send it to you if the superintendent will remind me. Okay? Okay. So please take advantage of things like that so that you can be more connected. You don't have to be an island. And I will just say to you, in Metro Atlanta, our school boards tend to be a lot more isolated from other school boards. We talk about Atlanta and the rest of the state. It does not have to be that way. Although some of the other districts are significantly smaller and they're in odd areas in the state, they have the same situations, the same concerns that you do. So please keep that in mind and try to work with each other, share information, ask questions, etc. Am I making sense? Okay, I've been relegated to stand behind this podium, and it's killing me. But I know that I have to do that, so I'm very uncomfortable. But if I walk away from the podium, just wave me back over here, okay? So in your packet, you should have several items. I think you should have 5 or 6 pieces in your packet. One of them is the policy update from GSBA. The other is a sheet with expectations for the superintendent, expectations for the school board. Your agenda, and I'm sorry I'm not doing it in the right order, but I don't have a copy of it. Your agenda indicates what the topics that we're going to cover this morning, and I must say to you that those topics are the ones that are approved by the Department of Education. Those are the domains that the department requires for boards, and on the reverse side of your agenda are the objectives for today's meeting. Do you see that? Okay, there is also a 1-page evaluation. I have given that to you now, and I will ask you to keep it available and go ahead and go through that as we move forward today, because at the end, you're going to want to get out of here, and you're not going to want to have to stop and do that. There is a small area at the bottom of that evaluation for you to write additional comments. It's not much room, but the reverse side is blank. So you can write whatever it is that you need. I'd ask you to do it so that it's legible, and give constructive criticism. If there's something that I focused on that wore you out, say so. Otherwise, the next time GSBA comes to present, guess what? You're going to get the same thing, okay? So let me know, and it lets GSBA know what we need to do to improve. You do not put your name on that paper. I don't know your handwriting, so we should all be fine. Let's see, there is also the GSBA, a copy of the GSBA ethics brochure. That is the colorful document. We'll be using that, and there's something else, I can't remember what it is. Okay, but everybody has the things that I did mention, right? Okay. All right. As we begin, I want you to approach this workshop as an opportunity. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is, as members of the governance team, let go of the need to be right. Let go of the need to be right. And I say that such that we can hear from other members of the team, digest what it is they're saying, and take it to heart. Even when one doesn't agree, we don't always have to be right. Please also let go of the feeling that you already know what you need to know for success as a school board member. That is especially inherent for veteran board members. But the state insists that we go through this training. It may be material that has been covered before, but when we go to church and they do the announcements over and over again, it doesn't hurt, does it? Okay. Let's agree to admit that there's always room for improvement, whether you're relatively new to the board or even if you're a veteran. In public education, there's constant change, so an open mind is essential. And it's my hope that following our time together, that you as a team may be willing to agree to try some new ideas so you can do the best job possible for Cobb County students. Now, I'm going to admit to you that I am reading from a script that I created for myself, and I'm doing that because I spent 17 years as a school board member. And as school board members and elected officials, we get a microphone, we lose our minds. I don't want to digress and go off on a tangent, so I am going to use the script. But please participate with me. Stop me, make comments, ask questions. I don't know everything, but I know a lot. And whatever I can't answer, I'm going to admit I don't know, and we'll get the information for you later. Is that fair? Okay. So please use your your PowerPoint handout, and that may help you to follow along. One of the thorns in the side of many school boards is undue influence. Focus on matters of relatively insignificance or just a preponderance of information that is not meaningful. The governance team must be willing to spend its time deliberating and moving forward on substantive ideas that will support and enhance student achievement. What we know most about school boards is the dysfunctional teams, because those are the ones that make the news. Am I right? Okay. Dysfunctional teams are absorbed with adult issues, things that have nothing to do with students and their academic success. So, please keep in mind that the most important things in the life of Cobb County schools are not things. The most significant focus for you is what? Students. Absolutely. So to that end, let's try to agree with a concept that is a little bit different from where you may have been. As an elected official, you are truly unique. Although elected by districts, I think you are here in Cobb County, right? Your duty and your loyalty cannot lie with the electorate. Now, I know that the room is not crowded, but there are individuals in your community who will hear about this and who will hear it. And I say it unequivocally. Your loyalty has to lie not with the electorate. You are accountable to the citizens of Cobb County, but you must vote in support of initiatives that satisfy the needs of these students as opposed to the wants of the voters. Now, that's not what our citizens want to hear. And I know that one of their favorite phrases is, I put you on the school board, I'll make sure that you get off. Do you hear that from time to time? So I would submit to you that we have to veer away from the R word. Do you know what the R word is? It is re-election. It is absolutely re-election. If the focus is on being re-elected, I can say this because I am retired. You're in the wrong place. That cannot be the focus. The focus has to be on students and what is best for them. And this is typically not palatable for the community. But unlike city council members, county commissioners, state representatives, etc., an effective school board member will often have to sidestep the wishes of the community. You have to look at matters globally, and you're often privy to information citizens haven't reviewed. Not to say that it's nothing to do with their intellect. It's the time that you devote to the information that comes before you as you prepare for meetings. And typically it is voluminous, is it not? If you offered it to citizens, they are unlikely to want to spend that kind of time reviewing it. So you digest that information and then you make a decision about doing what is best for kids. Your meetings are open, but you don't have a standing room only crowd. That is not different from other school boards, not only around the state, but around the nation. People show up when you're talking about football, cheerleaders, if you're rezoning, or if you're talking about the millage rate. But other than that, there's not a tremendous interest in the school board. You, however, have to be concerned about students. And it's not just the students who live in your neighborhood. Sometimes it's students who don't look like you, who don't go to your church, or who don't go to church at all. Some of them don't speak your language. Some of your children are in wheelchairs and communicate through a computer. They're different. They are alike. But you have to be concerned about globally about the students throughout Cobb County. Am I making sense? Okay, let's keep that in mind and recognize that the most important things in life are not things. So let's go on to talk about the school board and what it is you do. And I'm asking the question about who makes the decisions for Cobb County schools and Cobb County school students. It's essential to recognize that you are a governance body. So what is it that you deal with generically? You deal with policy, absolutely. You deal with policy, and your superintendent and his staff deal with procedure. Okay, can we agree on that? I think that we agree on it idealistically, and then we get caught up in the weeds. The board is responsible for what I call the what, and the staff has responsibility for the how. So board members should not attempt to tell the staff how to do their jobs because the school board does not run the school system. Now that is a newsflash for our neighbors because they want you to fire and hire the football coach. They want you to change the bus stop. They want you to determine who's going to wear uniforms and who's not, all of those kinds of things, many of which are operations and not policy. Okay? Are we in agreement? Okay. It's very quiet in here. Okay. That you can fight me on, huh? Okay. Well, I'm going to just hold on, okay? So the board is in place to offer direction to see that the school system is run well. And the thing that you have to remember is there is a huge difference between the two. The people who are sitting to my left, I assume, are staff members. Okay, they get paid to do what they do. And while you glean some money, it's not a salary. What you do is public service. And I encourage school board members to recognize and remember that because the focus cannot be on the kinds of things that they do. They come forward to the board, they give you information, you have the opportunity to ask questions, but the fact is they have been hired to do a job, and the board must trust its staff to do that job and to do it well. But the other thing is that the buck stops with the superintendent. He is accountable for the performance of the staff because they report to him and not to the board. Okay? Okay? Okay. So, let's talk about the board. And I do want you to interact with me here. If I'm saying something that doesn't work for you, say that. And let's talk about it. There are some gray areas when we talk about the board and the superintendent. Sometimes things seem to run together, but we have to remember that school board members must stay in their lane. All right? Okay. So the board, you represent the public, and you do serve as liaison between the school district and the community. But what that means is that you work with the administration to establish rules that govern students and schools. Now, when it comes to hiring, who is it that you hire? You recruit, you hire, and you empower the superintendent to be the educational leader of the school district. You're also responsible for performance evaluation, right? Okay. You participate in learning opportunities to improve your governance skills, and that's what you're doing today, and to better understand your role as school board members. So I would just say to the board, regardless of the number of years you've spent as a school board member, there's always something that can be learned. I mentioned that I was on the board 17 years. Subsequently, I have the opportunity to sit in new board member orientation from time to time. I learn something new every time I'm there. So please be willing to accept that and recognize that some things have changed. Some of you may remember what things were in place before August 2012 when that policy update that I've given you was written. I think there's at least one board member who was on the board before that took place. That was a big change. You also approved the planning process that includes stakeholders in developing your long-range strategic plan for student achievement. Now, you tell me, do you have a strategic plan? You do. What is it?
It's kind of like a Christmas tree.
Okay. Okay. How did you develop that strategic plan? Meaning what? Okay, and you did it in a week. Come on. It was a long process, months. Okay, and so when we say stakeholders, we know what we're talking about, but you are talking about some staff, citizens, business leaders, some board members. A lot of people participated in that process. So they went to meetings, right? Lots of meetings. And I can see by your response to me that you just get excited about coming to meetings. Don't we all? I mentioned that and ask you, have you memorized your strategic plan? Nobody? It is too voluminous for anybody to have memorized it. But I would challenge the board members to select one thing from your strategic plan that pushes a button for you and be able to focus on that and have a 30-second elevator speech for your constituents relevant to the strategic plan. Something that you can share with people to say, this is what we planned to do. This is how it has changed. When did you last do the strategic plan, have a major production of it? How long ago was that?
Probably around 2010, 2011, it was a major revision. 4 years ago.
Okay. So it's been a minute, and you'll be coming up on a time to revamp it, right? Because of the amount of time people spent being involved in the production of that strategic plan, that's why I'm asking you to be sure to have something that you can share with them. Some of that you plan to do probably did not go exactly the way you had hoped. There were some changes that have been made, and there are going to be some changes made as you revise the plan. Is that right? Yes, sir.
We also have each school develop a strategic plan and review their strategic plan each year. We still have that in place, right? Okay. So
Okay, that makes sense.
It's a living document, might say.
That's exactly what I'm trying to get to, that it becomes a living, breathing document. And I'll assume, too, that during board meetings, you reference the strategic plan from time to time. Is that right? Even if you don't say it specifically that way, the agenda items for your meetings are relevant to parts of the strategic plan. Is that correct? Okay. It's important to help the community to know that so that they recognize that the time they devoted to working with you on that strategic plan was not wasted. So please keep it alive before them, especially those parts that aren't working out, because everything doesn't go exactly the way you planned it. Okay, so that's important. The other thing I would ask is, does the board participate in self-evaluation? No? No formal process. Okay, that's not a requirement. You are required to evaluate the superintendent. How often? Annually, yes. The school board is not required to evaluate itself, but remember I said at the beginning, be willing to consider some new ideas? Self-evaluation is one of those. And self-evaluation for the school board doesn't mean pointing fingers at another member of the board. It is looking at the board as a unit How are we perceived by our community? How do our meetings go? How do we interact? Those kinds of things. GSBA, Georgia School Boards Association, does have a self-evaluation instrument. If you take a look at it, it might be something you'd want to use, or you might want to check with another state and see if other districts have self-evaluation instruments that you could use. Do you have an annual retreat? Okay, yeah, and I understand how that goes. If you're having a retreat, that's a good time to utilize a self-evaluation instrument to look at the board honestly and to make some improvements. So I would ask you to consider that. And I'm sure that the attorney is writing that down. Okay. As far as policy is concerned, that's another area for the school board, but you don't write policy, do you? Does the board write policy? No, no. You evaluate policy recommendations that you get from the superintendent, right? I mention that because sometimes people come on to boards thinking that they are going to create policies. It does not mean, however, if you think that there is a need for a policy, you could make that recommendation to the superintendent. He and his staff would look at it and come back to you. Is that right? Okay. The other area of your responsibility is finance. You establish priorities for financial management of the district, and you provide leadership in securing community support for the budget. Last night, there was a nearby district, I'm going to say who it was because it made the news. DeKalb County had a hard time getting its budget passed. And part of what you have to do as a school board, as a governance team, is to communicate with residents so that they understand what it is that you're dealing with when it comes to the budget. For example, before you got on the school board, did you recognize that there was a capital budget and an operations budget? Did you know that? Sometimes members of the community will see you making a renovation in a building, and they want to know, why are you spending money on this building when that could be going to somebody's salary? Have you ever gotten that question? Okay, and you know now as school board members that the capital funds and the operations funds are separate and cannot be exchanged, correct? It is incumbent upon you as leaders to share that with the community. Again, it doesn't have anything to do with their intellect, they just don't know. When it comes to what recently happened as far as the salary increase promised by the governor, was that an easy fix for you? It was. Did you explain it to your community so they'd understand what that $3,000 means and for whom? That's the role of the school board and the superintendent. You've got to help people understand what's going on as far as that's concerned. You also adopt policies for accounting for school funds and for reporting information through the board to the community. Okay, I know that you look at, you get a financial report every month? Quarterly? Okay, and when you get that financial report, what do you do with it? You review it, you ask questions. You don't go line item by line item. Theoretically, what you should be looking at is this where we were at this point last year? If not, if there's a gap, what are we going to do about it? Generic questions are what you ask about the fiscal operation, and you trust that your chief financial officer and your superintendent are looking at things critically, that they're giving you accurate and up-to-date information, correct? That is the role of the school board member. When it comes to curriculum, do you write curriculum? Some school board members want to. Okay, but you receive information about what curriculum is being developed, what's being presented to students. One of the things that we do in public education is we have a propensity for adding new programs, don't we? Adding them. So the school board has the responsibility to ask, if we're going to add this new program, is there anything that we're going to stop doing? What's not no longer relevant? What's not working anymore? Can we remove that? Because otherwise, we've got a pile of stuff that looks good on paper but isn't doing anything for students, right? Okay, the last place that I want to spend just a minute on is personnel. The board establishes criteria to be used in hiring and policies for personnel management, and that can include staff evaluation procedures. But the board should not be involved in hiring staff other than the superintendent, in performing performance evaluations for staff, and looking at personnel records. Am I right? Okay, it's important that we understand and recognize that, because the community does think that you hire people. Who hires the staff in this district? Superintendent. And the superintendent comes to you with what? When it comes to hiring staff, what does he bring forward to the board? The recommendations. Now, you have the right to vote yes or no on those recommendations, correct? But if something comes forward from the superintendent and you have a question about it, what do you do with that? You ask that question, and you try to ask that question in advance of the meeting to give the superintendent and his staff an opportunity to do the research and come back to you with valid information, okay? When it comes to things that go on with the board and the superintendent, the mantra has to be no surprises. Am I making sense? Okay, so you don't want to surprise each other. You don't want to surprise the superintendent. You don't want him to surprise you. And the worst thing is, even though this room may not be crowded, you have somebody sitting in this audience, and it becomes very obvious when an item is presented that there's somebody sitting at that board table who didn't have a clue that that was coming forward. That's not a good look. So no surprises. Please, please, board members, ask your questions of your superintendent in advance of the meeting, if at all possible. Sometimes it is through the presentation that a question will occur to you, and it's okay to ask that question at that time. It's helpful, however, if you'll make it clear that it just occurred to you, okay? When it comes to personnel, you should ensure that job descriptions are in place for staff. Those job descriptions are generic. You should act on the superintendent's personnel recommendation. You act on disciplinary tribunal appeals after thorough review of the information that was given to you. And again, you recruit, hire, and evaluate the chief operating officer. All of this is part of what is considered the what. That is the responsibility of the board, the what. And the foundation of that is trust. In order for the board to be able to work together as a team, and with the superintendent, there has to be trust. And trust is earned. It doesn't come automatically. It is earned, so your track record speaks for itself. So I would implore you to do whatever you can to develop that mutual trust and mutual respect. The superintendent respects your position as members of the school board. You respect his as the leader for this organization. Okay? Any questions? Okay, so we're clear as to what the role of the board is generically. As individual board members, executive session is not the only arena in which confidential information is shared. So whether the superintendent or the board chair or the board attorney or another board member has divulged private information, effective school board members must refrain from sharing anything that might put the school system at risk. Now, I'm looking at the board attorney because I'm sure that he will shake his head or give me some kind of body language notion if I'm inaccurate. But I think that that is essential, goes back to that trust. The only way you can establish and maintain trust with each other is to be able to respect confidentiality. And I would say to you that when a board member does breach that confidentiality, not only does everybody know it by the time you hit the parking lot, because your cell phone is ringing, but based on who we are and the way we speak, we also know who divulged the information. Now, the board may not sit at the board table and point a finger at the person, but they know. Am I wrong? Okay. Okay. So it is essential, it is tantamount to the success of this school district that you maintain confidentiality. The other thing is that children must always come first. I mentioned that earlier. Yes, you've got constituents who elected you, but your loyalty has to be to children. Their needs and their best interest has to be considered so that student achievement can improve. Good school board members must ask themselves, especially in school board meetings, what does this have to do with student achievement? So if you're sitting in a board meeting and you've spent 25 minutes on an issue and you ask yourself that question and the answer is nothing, then it's time to move on. Okay, can I get a nod or something? Yeah, all right, thank you. It's an important question at all times, but especially during meetings. So please keep that in mind. The other thing is that once the board has taken action, that is, the board has voted, it's the responsibility of members of the board to be supportive of that action. Now, I'm going to say something to this because I know a couple of years ago, there were a couple of school board members who went to the state legislature and suggested that GSBA and others were trying to infringe on their freedom of speech rights with this very statement. Let me explain that the way it was presented, the legislature acted, but what we are saying is you have an opportunity to express your opinion. When is that? During the board discussion, you have the opportunity to be recognized to express your opinion, so it's known when you agree and when you disagree. But when the board has voted, the state law says that there is a majority action. When the majority of the vote is in favor of something, it passes. And that is the decision of the board. It is your responsibility to help support that decision. And I think that what we're basically saying is don't sabotage the school board's decision. You've had a right to speak your mind. You should do that. The board member who sits at the meeting and says nothing and then votes no does a disservice to the other members of the governance team. They need to know what you're feeling. They need to know when you're opposed to an action. But once it has passed the board, it is your responsibility to support the action of the team. Is there disagreement about that? We're good? Okay. Sometimes that's hard. I'm going to give you an example. I chaired the Fulton County Board at one time, and we had a vote, a lot of discussion about an increase in our pay. I think at that time, our monthly pay was something like, I don't remember what it was, but anyway, it was a nice little piece of change, especially when we compare that with other districts around the state, some of whom don't get anything, some of whom get paid a small stipend per meeting. The vote was 6-1. I was the one, but I was also chair of the board. So you take that recommendation to your delegation and ask them to support it because that's the way the salary, the payment is increased. It was my responsibility to do that as chair of the board. Now, there is a God. Something happened with that. That was when the gas prices just went way up, and Fulton County was having a lot of problems with all those school buses, so the board decided, let's hold off. This is not a good time to put that forward. So, yes. So I didn't have to do it, but I was prepared to do it. And so that was something that was significant to me. I didn't support that at all, but it was my job to support it for the board. Does that make sense? And so I was going to have to go forward and speak for the board, not go to the delegation and poo-poo it, but to speak for the board in support of it. That is what we have to do in this work as school board members. And let me say one other thing. This whole thing about whole board governance team training came down from the State Department of Education because they obviously feel that the board and the superintendent need to work together as a team. I don't believe there are any other elected officials who are required to do training and who are required to do it as a team. Am I right? Okay, so the requirement for you is essential because it is expected that you, as a school board governance team, will work together. So please, please, please keep that in mind. Okay, effective board members are the liaison to the community. I mentioned that before. You're responsible for advising other members of the governance teams as to things that are being discussed in the community. If you hear something when you're pumping gas at the BP station, you know it's totally inaccurate, they're saying this about the school board, you bring it back, correct? Okay, you share that information so that everybody can have it at about the same time and you all can have an appropriate answer. It's not scripted, but you want the board to be speaking from the same page. Want everybody to be saying the same thing. If someone in the community hears something from this board member and the exact opposite from this board member, there's a big problem. So it's very important that you share information, that all of you get information at about the same time. And therefore, the superintendent knows how to reach each of you, correct? Okay, some of you are morning people. Some of you are not. In retreat, it's important to share that kind of information. If you're not a morning person, then a 7 a.m. call is not going to make you happy. And the exact opposite for those who are night owls, okay? The other thing is whatever information has been given to the school system needs to be consistent. Your phone number needs to be accurate. If you're asking for information by email, you got to check the email. If you're a text person, all of that is important. It's important with the superintendent, but it's also important with other members of the governance team. There are still members of school boards around the state who don't do email at all. But if you've got somebody on the board and they don't do email, you got to reach them where they are, okay? So the thing that happens in a board where you have 7 members is that sometimes you have a unit. You have 2 or 3 board members who are closer than the others. When you share information with the 2 or 3 that you've been closer to, that is not appropriate to leave it there. All members of the team need to get the information at about the same time. When you share it with just a few, and for this 7-member board, that would be, if you share it with just 3 other people, what are you doing? Well, you're counting votes. That's what you're doing. Not that you're necessarily doing it together, but if you contact 3 other members of the team, give them the information and agree on something, then you're counting votes and you're saying, I got my 4, I don't need to talk to the other 3. Please don't do that. Please make sure that everybody gets the same information at about the same time. Any comments? Okay. I do also want to share with you that school board members, you're often approached in the community by individuals who give you information that's specific to situations they are experiencing. Typically, that would be parents. But this is not a time for a school board member to promise to handle it. Every district has a chain of command. I don't know what yours is. My hope is that every member of the governance team does know what your chain of command is. Some districts have business cards, and on the reverse side of their business card, they have listed a chain of command so they can hand it to a constituent who is asking for something. The point I'm trying to make is that you should not involve yourselves as individual members of the team in fixing things for friends, for neighbors, for people who live in the community. Rather, help them to know how they should process getting the information that they need. So the chain of command, it should be written down somewhere. Hopefully each of you has it, but you need to be clear as to how that works. Okay? Okay. And remember that as members of the team, you do not speak for the Board of Education without authorization. And that means if a decision has been made by the board, that's your authorization. If the board is discussing something, you can't speak for the board, and that includes the chairman. Nobody speaks for the board until and unless authorized by the board. And who speaks for the district? The superintendent. So board members can't speak for the school district. You can speak for the board relevant to what the board has decided. And when you have disagreed with something, that's the focus that you want to have. Well, I didn't agree with that vote, but the board has decided, and you go on to explain what the action is going to be. Okay? All right. When we talk about school board members, there's a list there of the expectations of school board members. And I also gave you a sheet of expectations. It has 2 columns, and I think at the bottom of the sheet there is a picture of books. On one side, it has expectations of the superintendent, and that indicates what board members expect from the superintendent. Do you see it? It's a 1-pager. Yes, that's it. Is a stack of books on the bottom? Oh, it was on the bottom of the stack, sorry. Okay. That is kind of a suggestion of things that you can consider, especially because school board members tend to have expectations of the superintendent without recognizing that the superintendent has expectations of the school board members. The things listed on that particular document may not all be specific and relevant for Cobb County schools, but it's something that you can use. You can tweak it and make it your own. So when you have your next board retreat, that might be something that you could consider. Well, somebody's nodding, so I'm happy. Those are the kinds of little things that can make a difference sometime, because not only would that document serve the governance team, but it's something that you could show and share with members of the community so that they could understand this is what the superintendent and the staff expect of us as members of the governance team. This is what we expect of the superintendent. Okay? And I don't remember from whom I got that. It was a district in another state. I failed to keep track of the name of them, so I'm admitting publicly I did not create it. GSBA did not create it. Somebody did, and I just can't tell you who. All right? Any questions? Okay. I mentioned, yes, sir. Thank you.
I want to interject just a question to see if we can tap into you as a resource, because I know that you have the benefit of talking to lots of different school boards and following what's going on with different school boards. And so I guess I'll ask it this way. It's really just an open question. What challenges do you see school boards facing with some of the things that we've talked about this morning? What are the, I don't know if you want to call it hot topics or key things that other boards are trying to get through with some of these challenging concepts?
The big one is personal interaction. The relationships, I am going to give you your pen back. The relationships with board members. When there is strife at board meetings, it typically doesn't have anything to do with the issues. it's dealing with personalities. And that's when boards need to make time for retreat. The other thing that I see an awful lot is a lack of consideration for the role of the superintendent and staff. And that's why I kind of focused on that. I don't necessarily know one board from another until there is mess. But when board members decide that they are going to go and give direction and make significant requests from staff people, that creates a problem because you're the board. I don't care if y'all went to kindergarten with somebody who's working for the district. When you go and ask a question, there is an obligation that is felt by the staff person. So that can be a big one. The other one is, you ask about other districts. The other one is the disrespect that is demonstrated not only for other members of the team, but for the people who come forward to a podium like this to present information. I mentioned asking the superintendent ahead of time about recommendations with which you might disagree, but badgering a staff person who comes forward. And I would just have to tell you that for the most part, staff members are nervous about coming before the board. They just are. And so when they get questions and they cannot answer those questions, it is degrading. They feel incompetent and they dread coming before the board. Just asking inappropriate things, having staff people do individual things. So it's board members acting as individuals rather than acting as a unit. And expectation of, here's what it is. It's the board feeling that they're royalty. When I arrive, people must bow down. Don't you know who I am? That kind of thing. It's a major, major issue. And making promises to individuals in the community. Sometimes that happens during the campaign running, and sometimes it's simply because a person who's running for the board for the first time does not realize that he or she cannot do anything on their own. So I think those are some of the major issues. The final thing is the behavior in a board meeting. And we're going to talk about the board meeting, but it wreaks havoc for a board because then the community disrespects the board. Yes, sir.
Can you expound on situations where we have some districts that have board members that have been board members for 20, 30, 40 years, and that's majority of them. And then we have some board members or some districts that have boards that turn over rapidly. So what are the problems that you see mainly in the ones that are longevity?
Now, this is going to be generic because I've got people popping in my mind, and I'm not pointing fingers at individuals, but when a board member has been on the board, and we've got some in this state who've been on their board more than 40 years, and sometimes they're very good board members, but we get ingrained in certain things. If you're still working, you have a route that you take to go to work every day, right? If it happens to be Sunday and you're going to church, you find yourself going up 75 North and you say, doggone it, I passed through. You just do things because you do them, and they may not be relevant any longer. When a board member has been on the board a long time, their favorite phrase is, that's the way we've always done it. And you think in terms of something like in 1990, when boards were asked about cell phones, I was a board member, and I was one who was adamantly opposed to students having a cell phone in school. It was ridiculous. Well, kindergartners have cell phones now. So being able to accept that things have changed. But here's part of the issue. One of the reasons sometimes that a board member remains on the board so long is because generically 70% of our population don't have kids in school. So they're not paying any attention until you start dealing with the millage, okay? So they're not paying attention, and the person gets elected over and over again because they're the incumbent, and people just aren't giving them any consideration. That is not to say, however, that a person who's been on the board a long time can't be a good board member. All right? I think that the other thing that can be difficult is when you have a major change in the board all at once. I know that at one point, I don't know if they still do that, the Atlanta Board of Education used to be voted on all posts at once. I don't know if it's still like that. But many years ago, there was this campaign, somebody got upset, and the whole thing was erase the board. Anybody remember that? I know I'm not the oldest person in the room. But that's difficult because you need some institutional memory. It is important to have somebody who remembers this is what we did, this is why we did it, whether or not it worked. So I think the balance is good. When you have people rotating off from time to time, that can be extremely helpful. Did I answer your question?
In a lot of ways, I'm just curious about, what kind of problems does longevity board members actually create in the relationship with the superintendent? Because I can see, and I've heard that it's not always good. Small district, the board members have a whole bunch of relatives in the community.
Yes.
And so those relatives have certain wants, and it may not be best for the school system or what the superintendent wants to do. So do you run into that situation in the smaller districts?
Absolutely, because in smaller districts, almost everybody is related to almost everybody else. So regardless, there's going to be that issue. When the law changed and there was the thing about a person on the board and or the superintendent not being able to be related to an administrator. Remember that? Okay, in small districts, that was a major problem because really everybody's related to everybody else. But it also has an effect on the matter of personnel because board members want their brother-in-law's daughter's father, whatever, to get a certain position, and they insist on it. And they are more willing to go to the superintendent, close that office door, and say, now look, this is what we're going to do. So that can get to be a major problem. But again, I want to put that caveat in because I'm seeing faces come before me of individuals who have been on their board a long time. There's one situation where there's a board member who's been on more than 40 years. The superintendent has been there a long time. Obviously, they have a relationship. I don't know whether it's good or it's bad, but superintendent's still there. So it can be problematic, but I would say it doesn't have to be. Remember what I said a little earlier. What a school board member, no. What an effective school board member must have is an open mind. Because education is changing, things are changing, people are changing. The other thing to know is when you receive even one new person to the team, and that can be the superintendent or a board member, all bets are off. Things, some things are moot, and that is why I'd also recommend to this and any other board I've worked with, whatever it is that you do, put it in writing. I'll ask sometimes, do you have criteria for the public addressing the board? Oh yes, and this is what we do, but it's not written anywhere. So whatever your norms are, your protocol, do you have a board protocol? Board operating procedures? Okay, that's in writing, and the board needs the opportunity to review that periodically. The board retreat, the self-assessment, look at those things because the board is not exactly the same as it was, and that doesn't have to be bad. So if board members have the open mind, regardless of their longevity, the work can be successful. And there are issues sometimes we don't know about. There was a board where there was a lot of strife with the board chair. I found out he couldn't read. He could not read, not well. He couldn't read. Now that the superintendent knows that, they're able to work it out. He was elected. Okay, Mr. Morgan.
Thank you. I think one of the things that catches my attention in your presentation is to be lifelong learners on the board. And I think that one of the things that helps me tremendously is getting out and seeing different districts or different ways that things are done, good or bad, which I believe provides context. And I believe a slippery slope for any school board member is if you just, the only thing, predominantly what you experience is that school district in terms of what's done, how it's done, things of that nature. I think that could be a slippery slope to what you were saying about becoming stagnant and not even realizing that you're stagnant. But I have found that that's one of the ways I try to stay sharp is making sure that I'm constantly having conversations with other people from other school districts and teachers and getting out the state and seeing things so that, because I think if there's an appetite to be a lifelong learner, then there's a very good chance that you can be or become an effective school board member.
Points well taken. I think that speaks to what we talked about a little earlier. We talked about the hub, the GSBA hub, how that can help you, that social media network with other board members around this state. If you have the opportunity to attend the National School Boards Association Conference, I don't know how many of you have ever gone, but that is the best part about an NSBA conference is being on the shuttle bus. It absolutely is, because you're seated next to somebody who could be from Hawaii or wherever else, and you get an opportunity as you're waiting through the traffic to talk to somebody else about things that are going on. The exchange of business cards, so you have someone else to call. Talking to someone from the state of Florida, where the Sunshine Law is so very restrictive for school board members. I believe that it's still, that they can't even ride to a meeting together, you know? So sometimes just finding out that things are different in other states, in other districts, can be amazing. There are things that Metro Atlanta school districts can learn from people who are in rural Georgia. And I think that opens the door for me to again say that in Metro Atlanta, we are considered so separate. And there are people in other parts of the state who say, oh, Atlanta this, Atlanta that. Sharing information can be extremely helpful. You all are very much the same. The difference is in the size. The issues are pretty much the same. And I'm sure the superintendent has had the opportunity to talk to superintendents from other districts. They have the same kinds of issues. Little bit different, but very much the same. Yes, sir.
In the last few years, we've had several school districts in the metropolitan area that have become, I would call, dysfunctional. Are you going to get into that in your presentation, or should we just do it now?
Let's do it now.
Okay. We've had several school districts, and I don't know whether it's the board members and the superintendent, or just the board members, or what the main causes are. But we've had several districts that have been unaccredited and had to reinstate their accreditations. And we have an issue going on, I think, in Lee County right now. But we've had DeKalb, we've had Clayton County, and we had the city of Atlanta. Can you just talk about what was the cause of those dysfunctions?
I think it starts with the basics that we were going through this morning, and it gets, you sit there and you say, oh gosh, do I have to hear this again? The role of the school board member, understanding that the role of the board member is policy, is governance. It's not running the district. I think that in many instances is where it starts. It starts with school board members trying to tell staff people what to do. Put this child in this person's class. Move this bus stop. Just things like that, defying the superintendent, undermining the superintendent and his or her ability to do their job. I have experienced some horror stories. Now, we have 189 elected school boards in this state. Most of them function well. But when things are going smoothly, that doesn't make the news necessarily. So it's the other ones. Typically, it doesn't have anything to do with student achievement. It's personalities. It's the school district where, oh gosh, I'm thinking of one in particular, where the board decided that they were upset with the finance director. And so they managed to fire the finance director. Did we not speak about this earlier? The hiring and firing of personnel, and how does that happen? That it's a recommendation from the superintendent? Well, this was not a recommendation from the superintendent. They fired the finance director. Then they had a member of the board who was going into the finance office on a daily basis handling the business. I'm not making it up. Okay, the dysfunction is dealing with adult issues. Much of the time, it's trying to satisfy a special interest group in the community. My friends, my neighbors want this. One district, it was about the middle school principal. Small district, so you have a middle school. The hiring of the middle school principal. Superintendent brings forth a recommendation. 5-member board, 3 of them say, not having it. Superintendent goes back, comes back with 2 other names. The board had an individual in mind and insisted that that individual be hired. The superintendent said, this is not the person I believe is going to be successful. What do you believe that the superintendent did? Absolutely. Lives in that community, it's a small district, didn't want to, but there's no way I can be successful as superintendent if the board is directing me as to who to hire. And to say we don't like this recommendation, but to receive another is different. But when the board dictates this is the person who needs to get that job, see, you can't hold your superintendent accountable for the performance of an individual that he did not feel confident could do the job. So I think that is the main thing. Sometimes it's infighting among board members. And let me just be frank, it doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with race. It's just, I don't like him, and I don't like her. And it's assuming the motives of other members of the team. Many, many times that's what it is. And it just disintegrates. There is one district not too far from here where 2 board members came on new and began wreaking havoc before they were ever sworn in. And they have done it ever since. And it's sometimes, and I don't know what your various experiences are, so this is not personal. But sometimes it's because a board member comes on and because of his or her experience think they know more than everybody else. I'm an attorney. And therefore, I can tell you, I have 40 years as an educator, and therefore I know that kind of thing. And just, beating people up with that information. Those are the things that wreak havoc in school boards. Not being willing to listen. And I think that for a school board, during your debate, during your discussion, it's not just listening with the ears. We have to listen to each other from the heart. And that focus, again, has to be what is best for students, not just the students who live on my street. What is best for students? Being willing to have global vision. So that's how the horror stories come up. And that's how boards have ended up being wiped out. And you know that some of them were totally... And that was sad because we all talk about Clayton County, and if you go to any other state and mention that you're on a school board in Atlanta, they're going to ask you about Clayton County, even now. I don't know how many years ago that was. Everybody on the Clayton County board was not an ineffective board member. They had some good folks on that board. But unfortunately, the whole board was wiped clean at that time. The other thing I would say is this. When those things happen, people get caught up. Because as individuals, most of the time, school board members are on the board because they want to do something good. They get caught up in stuff. So unless you've come onto the school board expecting you're going to be like Jimmy Carter and get elected president, you know, some people do use it as a stepping stone. That's the wrong reason. Some people on the board, and they don't even like kids. Did I answer your question? I don't want to call names. I don't want to, you know, I'm willing to do that sometimes when a board has made the news. But the main thing is, if you as individual members of the team would be willing to step back and talk to each other, communicate with each other, and then come to the board table with that mutual respect, things can be achieved. Now, the word tells us that when we have aught with our neighbor, we go to the side and we discuss it. It's when somebody tries to get somebody else told from the board table that confusion starts. If we have aught with our brother and we cannot resolve it that way, then we call somebody else in to help us. And the word references the elders. There is a way to resolve conflict without it having to get ugly. And I would just say that even though you don't have a standing room only audience, there is somebody who'll be sitting in the room when dysfunction goes on. And when they leave, they may be in the grocery store, at the gas station, or someplace, and they start talking about it. Who's there? The kids. They're in the car, or they're standing there. They hear it. And when that begins to happen, there is a trickle-down effect. If board members don't respect the superintendent, if the superintendent doesn't respect the board, the administration begins to get tense and dysfunctional. And then the principals hear about it. And they start having issues. And then the teachers are having issues with the principals. And then guess what happens? Discipline rates go up the wazoo. You don't want that. And it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to agree with each other. There are people in your house you don't agree with. Okay? We don't have to, and you don't have to go home with each other. But it's important, it's essential that as a team, you can work together. Now, I am going to ask for a 5-minute break.
Sounds good. Thank you. Let's all take advantage of the 5-minute break.
Okay, the part that I talked to you about earlier about the self-assessment, I just mention it again and just remind you that when you get ready to do some kind of self-assessment, recognize that it is not a finger-pointing exercise, but it's an opportunity to ask and answer questions about the board in general. How do we handle our responsibilities? Do we understand our roles and the separation of our roles? How are we as a collaborative body, that kind of thing. And I think the support that you can get relevant to the role of board members is in the GSBA ethics brochure. Each of you has a copy of that. Please know that that too is a public document. It is available on the GSBA website, but you can give citizens access to it as well. And that can be very helpful in explaining the different domains. It talks about what is ethical behavior. It indicates what, as board members, you are responsible for doing. And sometimes it's seeing it in writing that can be helpful to others who have not had the opportunity to go through new board member orientation. Okay, so please feel free to share that. In addition, on the GSBA website, under School Board University, there is the e-boardsmanship manual. I do not remember exactly where it is, and if you need help with that, and let me know, I will be glad to give you the link-by-link directions. But that particular manual gives you information even in more detail than is here in the ethics brochure, and that too is available to the public. So again, I think it can be helpful for you when others understand your limitations and they recognize that you cannot make things happen, that you have one vote alone, okay? So please recognize that. And as the questions were asked a little bit earlier, I do want you to know that this will not be the last that you will see of me. Well, maybe not seeing, but hearing from me. I'm going to be checking with the superintendent to see if there are any things that you have agreed to take on in respect to your own improvement as a board, and giving you some ideas and then seeing that you follow through on them is helpful for me. Otherwise, I feel like I went and spent some time. Now, I'm going to get paid. Okay, but, you know, my hope is for the children, and I don't have to live in Cobb County to care about the children who live here, because if I'm out there on that expressway, the likelihood that if I get hurt, that the person who comes along as the EMT is a product of public education is very high. I want him or her to have the best education they could possibly have, okay? And I think we all feel that way, and that is part of what we need to share with some of our citizens, some of whom have never had children, who don't have children in school now. They need to care. These are the people who are running the businesses and driving the Uber and all of that kind of thing in our community. So let's make sure that they are aware that they have access to that information. Okay, so, oh, yeah, sorry.
For those who don't know it, this, Ms. Bowie is retiring for the second time. She's retiring from the GSBA, and her retirement was announced at the GSBA conference. So when she says she's still going to be doing this, she will not be working for the GSBA, but she'll be an independent person. So, and making probably a lot more money. Just want to let everybody know where you're at.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. I appreciate that. Okay. All right. So we talked about the board. We talked about the board members. Let's talk about the superintendent and his role. The superintendent is employed at the pleasure of the board. That is the pleasure of the board as a unit, not individual members or member. The superintendent should have a close relationship, working relationship with the board chair, but the superintendent doesn't report to the board chair. No offense. It's important that people know that. And to that end, let me ask, do you have a job description for the board chair? You do. Okay, and everybody is privy to it? All right, that's wonderful. So it's the board as a unit, not individual board members. The superintendent is expected to delegate authority to other staff. No way could one person run the school district. And that is the case for one of the school districts I can think of that has one school. Everything is in one building. And at one time in that district, the superintendent and the principal were the same person. Okay? But it's grown a little bit. So, you know, there are issues all around the state. The superintendent delegates authority, but still has final responsibility. The buck stops there. He provides educational leadership to the board, to the staff, and to the community. I was with the district last night, and one of the new members came up to me at the end and said, "Oh, I was so uncomfortable because I don't have an education background." That is not a requirement to be a good school board member. You expect the educational leadership to come from the superintendent and his staff. They are the experts, okay? You're dealing with policy. You're dealing with people and with how people react to that. The superintendent is a manager and provides the board with material as requested from the board as a whole. And here's where we have to be careful. As individuals, you have different interests, different tastes, etc. But if 7 people put demands on the superintendent constantly, even starting with this thing that we do. Quick question. 45 minutes later, we're ending that conversation. So you'd multiply that times 7. It can be overwhelming. So recognize that the material requests, sometimes the superintendent may turn to a board member and say, let's see how the board feels about that, especially if it's requiring research. All right? And the same thing applies for other staff, because if as individuals they are inundated with requests that, you know, they go and dig through information, then they may not be dealing with the priorities given to them by the superintendent. So I want to be careful. The superintendent should provide the board with written goals and objectives to meet the board's expectations. That's part of that performance evaluation. When you finish one year, you plan the expectations and goals for the next year. And he's nodding his head, so I'm okay. Maintains the necessary certification to be a qualified school administrator, and works with the board for the good of the district. Now, the superintendent is not going to do anything to make the board look bad, but his goal is for the good of the district. And when we talk about the district, we're talking about those students. Okay. The superintendent maintains respect and trust with all members of the board, but he accepts the right for there to be diverse opinions. He does not expect to agree with every one of you all the time. When it comes to policy, he acts as the advisor to the board in areas requiring policy development or revision. Typically, that evolves from the legislature having gone through some changes, state board rules, et cetera, and when those change, they may impact policies. He drafts the written policy and provides data that supports the policy recommendations. So when those policies are brought forward to the board, ask questions. That's your responsibility. Ask questions. But again, we ask questions seeking clarification, not to get somebody told. You know how people do, roll the head around on their neck, hand on the hip. We're not doing that in the school board, okay? Maintains the current policy manual and ensures accessibility to all stakeholders. Your manual is, okay, so anybody can access it. Sometimes you'll have to walk them through it, but they know how to get to it. And it's a big difference from the way it used to be when the policy manual was in a 3-ring binder. Anybody remember that? It was about yay thick. And it sat up on a shelf someplace, and they had to come to the district building or to a school in order to access it. And if you pulled at it wrong, the pages came out, and it was a mess. Anyway, this is much better. Develops and implements rules, regulations, and procedure for implementation. As a result of those policies, the superintendent and his staff then develop procedures. School board does not develop the procedures. You become aware of what they are, but the superintendent develops those procedures, okay? And he assists the board in identifying areas where revision is necessary. You may come up with an idea, and it is appropriate to pass that along to the superintendent. But he knows more about what's going on legally, about what's coming down the pike from the state or from federal government. And so listen to him when he says this is not going to be appropriate at this time. In finance, the superintendent should prepare the detailed budget based on your district priorities, and those are things you discuss ongoing. He submits the budget to the board for your consideration, and that budget process is a little lengthy, isn't it? Okay. He provides the rationale and helps you to cultivate community support for the district budget. And just know, anytime you get ready to present the budget, there's going to be some unhappiness. He provides regular reports to the board on the financial condition of the district, and I believe you all said that that was quarterly. Okay, and the board knows that and expects that. He also deals with the list of bidders for the amounts that exceed the limits designated by law or by board policy. So all of those things. He also assists the auditor by providing the information and making staff and materials accessible, correct? Okay, when it comes to curriculum, the superintendent provides leadership to staff and board on continuous development, implementation, and evaluation of instructional programs. And that's where I was talking about sometimes you got to cut some things. In education, we have a problem with that. We've got some programs that we've had for years and years, but we're more in line with doing evaluation and determining what is no longer necessary. He recommends policy for selection of curricula, for equipment and materials for teaching and learning. We know that many people in our community do not realize that we no longer have blackboards in the classroom. Still think that the students can vie to be the one who gets to wash the blackboard. Well, that doesn't happen anymore, does it? Do we have any? Okay. A lot of our folks don't know that. When we do go to schools as citizens, we don't typically go into a classroom. So if you all have an opportunity to invite people into the school, be sure that they get a sense of what's really going on in the classrooms. And let me just point out, GSBA does offer a program called Villa, and it is an opportunity for you to take a PowerPoint kind of presentation, insert in it your own information, invite people from the public to come and learn what's going on in Cobb County schools. You mold and make it your own. You can have 6 sessions ending in a graduation, but you're dealing with more than parents. And that is to help people to understand what it is you do, how you do it, what you're up against. If you want some information about that, remind me, and I'll be glad to send it. But it becomes your program. GSBA does not tell you how to do it. That can be real helpful in getting community support. The superintendent also reports to the community the status of education in the district. And then there is personnel. He recommends to the board employment, promotion, transfer, retirement, or dismissal of certificated and classified staff. You have the opportunity to ask questions. You have the opportunity to let him know your concerns, and he has the opportunity to respond. Please remember, as members of the school board, the superintendent is accountable for the performance of the staff. Therefore, if the board thinks that Zendabui walks water and they want to recommend her to be in charge of the math department, I hope he will know that I don't do numbers. So you want to let him make those recommendations and him to stand by his recommendations, and you support him as much as you can. But if there is a question, ask it, and ask it in time for the superintendent to do the research and get back to you. He establishes the job descriptions, the procedures for recruitment, for hiring and assignment, and the expectation of all staff. Okay? He is the board's liaison to staff, notifying employees of board action. And that is one place where we fall short many times. We're all gung-ho about getting information out to the community, and we fail to talk to our own staff people. The bus drivers and the food service workers need to know what's going on with the board. They're citizens too. And the thing to know is that for many people, when they think of Cobb County Schools, they're thinking of those buses. So those bus drivers need to be up to speed as to what's going on, please. All of this that I've mentioned relevant to the superintendent is the how. Remember I said earlier, the board deals with the what, the superintendent deals with the how, okay? Any questions? Yes, sir.
Can you, from your experiences, expound on what the difference is from school districts that have long-term superintendents versus those districts that have a very rapid turnover, which Cobb County has been in the past? What's the differences?
It depends. I think that in Metro Atlanta, there is far less longevity in superintendents than in other parts of the state. I think Alvin Wilbanks is the longest serving superintendent in Metro Atlanta. One of the things to be careful about, and you know, I hate the turnover in superintendents because you lose some of that institutional memory. And often when a superintendent moves, especially if it's someplace that's close by within the state, some of those people, some of those staff people move too. So you lose the continuity of people who know what you did before and why you did it. So that can be a little disturbing. I think the other thing that happens when you get a new superintendent, you got to start over. All bets are off, as I said. Everything changes. And there is that forming, you know, where everybody has got to get to know each other and how to work together, and the whole thing about I'm a morning person, I'm not, I don't do text, you know, whatever it is, all of that starts over. On the other hand, in education, there is always change. So change in the superintendency does not have to be a bad thing, but it does stall things for a while until everybody finds their way. Having everything in writing can make a difference so that the expectations are clear. Hiring a superintendent and not just trying to fill a spot, but helping to make sure that that superintendent, that person coming on new, has the same kind of values as the board, understands the district, has the real experience you need. All of that can make a difference. But now you're asking my opinion, and I'm not an educator, but I think that it certainly does not hurt to have a little bit of time with the same superintendent. And he didn't pay me to say that.
From your experience, I'm more of an in-house type person, and particularly if it's a large school district, that if we don't have somebody that's qualified to be superintendent, then we're doing something wrong. But does that work in a small district, and why don't larger districts do more of promoting within house?
Again, I would say it depends. Just because someone has been with the district a while does not mean they're necessarily going to make a good superintendent. There is a skill set that you look for in a superintendent, just as you look for in a board chair. You know, everybody who sits on the board does not necessarily need to be chairman. A person who has worked in the district may or may not qualify to be a good superintendent. And sometimes what they do bring some old history, some expectations from people with whom they have worked. But it depends. Some people have come up through the ranks and they've been excellent superintendents. The other thing that has happened in our state is that we have 2 districts where a former superintendent is now serving on the board as a board member. Now, that would appear to me at first thought as being a disaster waiting to happen. But in those 2 instances, it has worked out well. So it depends. It depends on the person, on their characteristics, on the reason they want to be superintendent, or if they're being coerced into being superintendent. Okay? I think he's got a pad over there where he's got trick questions for me. Okay. All right, so we're okay with the role of the superintendent and understanding that? Okay. Well, let's move on. We need to talk about the school board meeting. And one thing that I would say to this board is that the school board meeting is your forum. That is where you're kind of on. The disadvantage for Cobb County is that you're always being recorded. And I say that because sometimes we have a tendency to play to the camera. And you want to be careful about that. This is a meeting. It's a meeting of the board in public. It's not a public meeting. I'm going to say that again. It is a meeting of the board in public. It is your business meeting. The purpose of the meeting is to get things accomplished. And so I do want you to refer to the policy update that is in your packet. Looks like this, policy update. It is dated August 2012. Don't freak out. It's old, but it still works. So I'm going to ask you to keep that kind of near, and just remember that what you see when you're doing the board meeting may not be what the community is getting. So I want you to consider, as we talk about the meeting, the school board meeting, what message does our school board meeting send to the people who get to see the meeting later? Consider it from the perspective of Cobb County residents who aren't necessarily aligned with you, the ones who don't know you, the ones who may not live where you live. Be mindful of the fact that even though the room's not crowded, I know I keep referring to that, but Cobb County constituents are aware of what goes on with the Board of Education. So ask yourself, during the meeting, what does your facial expression say? What about the tone of your voice? Are you speaking loudly enough to be heard and understood? I went to one meeting at GSBA. We were encouraged to go to school board meetings, and I went to one where the setup was similar to yours, and the board member who was sitting next to the chairperson was able to manipulate. Now, I'm never good with those chairs as to getting them up and down, but was able to manipulate the chair such that the back was, it looked like it was on a chaise lounge, okay? He was lying down for all intents and purposes. I'm serious. I'm not making this up. I just will not reveal the location of that. But throughout the meeting, when he had something to say to the board chair, it was like a private conversation. He'd lean over, say his thing, and the chair would respond. This is a meeting of the board in public. So the public needs to be able to hear you. You have the microphones, use them effectively. If you're at church, sometimes a person has a microphone, it's way over here and they're talking. You know, you can't hear anyway, so use your microphone effectively so that people can hear you and understand. And to that end, I beg you, please stay away from acronyms. I have mentioned GSBA several times. I believe I also said Georgia School Boards Association. Everybody does not know what those acronyms stand for, and they can be intimidating. DOE, we all know what it is, but you have to say Department of Education from time to time. Please, in the meetings, when a staff person comes up and gives a presentation, they are accustomed to that language. So raise your hand, Mr. Chairman, can we ask what is SPLOST? Let the person spell it out. Please don't say for the benefit of the audience, because that then puts them down again, and we don't want to do that. Okay, so Are your questions designed to seek clarification or to call somebody out on a topic that is annoying to you? Are you asking questions that were clearly answered in the board packet? And if so, is it your intention to be sure to get specific facts out for the public, which is fine? Or is your question being presented because you haven't reviewed the packet? Okay. Are you argumentative with your comments, or are you supportive? Are you dominating the meeting, or are you a wallflower? And let me say this, there is always somebody on the board who's going to be more talkative than others. It's not a problem, but at least let your body language let people know that you are alive. Be alert. I served with one board member where people were constantly calling saying, is she asleep? So please, let people know that you're here, you're good, okay? All right, if you will take a look at the policy update, one of the questions we get most often at Georgia School Boards Association is this a meeting? Do you all have work sessions? Okay. Many times there is confusion as to whether or not a work session is a meeting. Can we vote? That kind of thing. This document on page 1, on the left column toward the bottom, gives information as to what is a meeting, and basically says that anytime you have a quorum of the board and it gives this list, to discuss, present, formulate, or vote on something dealing with school business, that is a meeting. So your work session is a meeting. This training is a meeting. And you started it off with the call to order, and it is a meeting. It's public. People can come. This document also tells you what is not a meeting. So if you went to the Georgia School Boards Association summer conference that just took place, that is not a meeting. However, while there were several boards that did have individual meetings that were facilitated by GSBA staff, but they had to post notice about those meetings. They may have been from Brunswick and they're in Savannah having the meeting, but they still had to publish notice, post it, give their agenda, etc., because that was different than the training, okay? So there is a description of what is not a meeting. And remember, when you get together with a quorum, be careful. If you're going to the football game, it's fine for the whole board to be there and to sit together. But when you get into your own huddle and start whispering about something, you might be talking about a television show. But if you give the impression that something is going on, the superintendent has called you together, that's what creates problems. Okay, so at the football game, you should not be discussing board business. We're clear? All right. In this document, it tells you what is a meeting, what is not a meeting. It also points on page 1 to email communication. That's on the right column at the bottom, and just says that email communication is not a meeting. However, emails are subject to disclosure under Open Records Act. And I believe that the attorney will give you clarification as to when you're getting in trouble with emails. I'm not going to try to touch that. I am not an attorney. I'm not legally trained, but you do want to be careful with things like that. The one thing that I would say to you is, do not put in writing anything you don't want to appear on a billboard. And I'm serious about that. It could be a Post-it note. Don't write it down if you don't want it known, because if it has anything to do with public education, it can be subject to open records. Am I right? Okay, he's nodding his head, so pay attention. Okay. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about meeting minutes. We did just have a workshop for administrative support people. I don't remember if anybody from Cobb was there. We have done it 3 times. We go into a lot of detail with support staff about what's in the minutes and what is not. But let me say to you as board members, because sometimes it's a board member who is asking that certain things be included in the minutes. The minutes, in accordance with Robert's Rules of Order, which I assume is your parliamentary authority, okay? The minutes reflect the action that takes place at the meeting. It is not a listing of the discussion, who said what, how they said it, et cetera. That is a transcript, okay? So board members, please don't ask the person who is recording the minutes to give all of that kind of detail. Besides that, that kind of detail can get you in trouble. But the minutes record the action of the board. And there are specific things that need to be included in the minutes. Since you all don't do your own minutes, we share that with the support staff who provide them, and I know that you're recording things anyway, so that can be very, very helpful. But you don't want, your minutes shouldn't be 9 and 10 pages. You also have minutes of your executive session, and they are very different from the minutes from the regular meeting. They are succinct, basically says that you made the motion, that the motion covered what the topic of consideration was going to be. You all know that your executive session discussion is extremely limited, right? Okay. At the end of your executive session, who signs the affidavit? You all do, okay. The law changed. This was in 2012 as well, where it gave boards the opportunity to have everyone sign. Prior to that, the law said that the chairman and the superintendent, I believe, would be the one signing. So by signing that, you are assuming responsibility for adhering to the law and complying with it. So if you happen to be in executive session, I'm pretty sure your attorney is in there with you. So you're less likely to stray away. But you don't wait for the chairman to be the one to have to say, wait a minute, I don't think we should be discussing this. Anybody should mention that if you think you're straying from the appropriate topics, okay? Your executive session minutes are not made public like your other minutes are. They are subject to subpoena, have to be ordered by a judge, okay? And that's usually happens if you've made somebody mad and they feel that you were talking about something that was inappropriate. In the same document that I gave you, on page 4, there is the information about the violations, the fines, to which one is subject, if there is a violation of the Open Meetings Act. And it talks about additional violations. So don't do it once and definitely don't do it twice. Okay, any questions about that? If you do have questions about that kind of thing, direct them to your board attorney because he can give you the particulars about that, okay?
Excuse me, but did anybody get page 4? Okay, we'll find it on.
It's
yeah.
page 6 of the packet.
Oh, page
It's the
okay.
4th page of the packet, as Ms. Bowie said, but it's...
Is it there? Oh, that was a test. You passed. I apologize. I'm just reading. Oh. Okay. We're good? I'm so sorry. Yes, sir.
I have a question. In board meetings, have you observed or have an opinion where significant issues are not discussed enough? And the other side of that, where issues not necessarily significant are discussed too much, even though in an orderly fashion?
Both those things can happen. Typically, the superintendent and the board chair get together with some other staff to put together the agenda. In putting together the agenda, there ought to be some kind of estimate as to how much time will be devoted to various topics. My suggestion to you is to go ahead and put that information on the agenda that goes to the board members. It gives them some kind of sense of what your anticipation is. That way, if there's a board member who feels sure that it's going to require more time, they have the opportunity to ask about that ahead of time. Now, that's my recommendation. That doesn't come from the law or the Lord. But I recommend that and recommend that it not be included in the agenda that is given to the public. If something occurs where the time becomes a little different, and it may be warranted, you don't want your feet held to the fire because you said on the agenda that it would only be a 10-minute discussion, and it turned out to be 15. On the other hand, if you're going to use a system like that, then there needs to be general agreement that you're going to try to adhere to those limitations. When you announce your meetings, do you announce an adjournment time? You don't. Okay. Well, okay. You have some idea in mind as to how long the meeting's going to be?
Yeah, let me speak to that just for a minute because that has changed. So about maybe 2 years ago, we switched from having 2 meetings a month where one was a work session, one was a voting session, to having 1 meeting a month and having having the work session start at varied times, depending on what the agenda is. So there is kind of a yes to your question about adjournment times, because when we get to the voting meeting, all the discussion has taken place prior that day. So it's just the voting of the agenda items. So generally, what really governs the adjournment time is how many recognitions we have for that night. So aside from that, the business part of the meeting where the items are voted on generally is pretty quick.
Pretty quick. And the chair does announce to the public that we have already discussed these matters and therefore will move through this portion of the meeting fairly quickly. That's important.
And also, potentially, we also have a consent agenda item as well. Yep.
Yeah, and everybody knows how to utilize the consent agenda. Okay, because when you get to a meeting where board members are still wanting to discuss those items, those need to be pulled from the consent agenda. And that should not be a surprise. I mentioned that earlier. If there's something with which a board member has discomfort, does not feel confident that he or she is going to be able to vote yes, say so before the meeting starts so that it can be pulled and people would be aware of it. But I think that something like having those assignments of time allotments can help move the meeting along. And since you have your work session first, there still should be some idea of how much discussion is going to be required. The other thing is, if it becomes burdensome, there can be, depending on what the item is, a motion to defer that, to postpone that to the next meeting or something of that nature. Does that help? Okay. Let's go through some of the things on dealing with the meeting. You have your agenda, and we've already said that it is put together with the superintendent, staff, and the chairman. That is your order of business. There is an opportunity, you can change that if the need be. For example, if you know there is an action item and a person is going to have to leave and wants to make sure that he or she will be able to vote, they can ask that something be moved up on the agenda. That should not be a routine thing, because if it becomes routine, it becomes suspect. And what happens is that people in the community assume you're hiding something. That's why you keep moving it around on the agenda, so you don't want to do that. As far as the agenda is concerned, the board members need to know how they can get items on the agenda. Every district is different. The superintendent has met with the board chair to put together an agenda. If you have something you want the board to discuss, that should be made, knowledge should be made of that ahead of time. Do you have a procedure for adding, for board members? Is it in writing?
Yes,
Okay.
and we ask for people to give us the agenda request 2 business days in advance of the agenda prep by email.
Okay, so everybody is aware of that. And see, that's one of those things that you discuss in board retreat. Is that working? Does that work for everybody? How is that going? That should be discussed at some point. Those are the things that you have as, sometimes as practice, sometimes as your procedure, but the board needs the opportunity to review that. So everybody is aware. The law allows the board to amend the agenda, and the wording is something to the effect of as it becomes necessary. And the determination that it's necessary to amend the agenda comes from the board. It's your agenda. The superintendent is the one who's most likely to recommend that something be added to the agenda last minute or taken off. And that typically has something to do with something operational, something from the state, et cetera. But the board would then vote to amend the agenda, okay? It is also important that you follow the agenda. Do you give copies of the agenda to the public when they come? Okay. Oh, of course. Okay, so everybody knows what it is you're going to talk about, and you want to follow that. You don't want to just skip something and not alert people as to what's going on. Speaking of that, as you begin your meeting, if a board member is absent, I hope that you say something. Ms. Bowie is not here this evening. She's out of town on business. Something like that?
Kind of taking attendance.
Okay, that's important because otherwise, again, there is that perception. What's really going on? Where is she? You know, have they kicked her off the board? Okay, so you want to do that. The other thing is you do want to complete the agenda, and I think that may have been the question that you were getting to. You want to finish that, so board members need to be conscientious about it. When we started this segment, I said something about dominating the meeting. You have a job description for the board chair. And I'm going to get with the superintendent, ask him to send it to me so I can look at it. Everybody needs to understand the role of the chair. And part of that role is to keep the meeting on track. So if he says, Ms. Bowie, you've spoke to this item 3 times, we're going to let another board member speak, that's not being rude. It's moving the meeting along. That is the role of the chair or the vice chair in the absence of the chair. And that's why I said everybody doesn't have the skill set to be an effective chair. That has to be said calmly, quietly, but firmly. Okay? All right. So that would enable you to complete the agenda. All of us love going to meetings, I know that, and all of us want to spend the night at the meeting, right? So just because something has gotten in your craw, saying it 13 times is not going to make people change their opinion. As a matter of fact, they are more likely to dig their heels in. If you want to say something a second or third time, it needs to be new information. Any questions? Yay. Okay. When it comes to debate, Robert's Rules of Order follows the procedure that's outlined in your handout. However, for small boards, and Roberts refers to small boards as the number 12 and fewer, it is appropriate for you to have the discussion first and then call for the motion. My first experience as a board member, it drove me crazy. I'm a parliamentarian. I know you're supposed to have the motion before you discuss, but Roberts does give you that license. So if you make the motion first and you go through the process, that's fine. If you have the discussion first and then call for a motion, that is fine too. Doing it that way typically prevents you from having to amend the motion. Okay, so you can do it that way. But what's important is even when you get something from the superintendent and it's written out and it's explicit, the motion needs to be made by a member of the board. The superintendent can't make a motion. He presents the recommendation and then a member of the board says, I move that. Rather than repeating the whole thing that he has read, this is the one time, please don't tell any other parliamentarian I said this, but you can say, I so move. It's already been read into the record. Okay? When the chair calls for the vote, the chairman calls for the yes votes first. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hand or say aye, whatever it is. The chairman gives some direction as to how to vote. This thing where we say all in favor, what is that? Okay, so all in favor, do something. Then the chairman calls for the negative votes. If a board member is going to vote in opposition to a motion, that should have been made clear during the discussion. The board member who sits, who says nothing, and then votes no, does the board a disservice. Remember, no surprises? Well, if you haven't said anything, then it's a surprise if you vote no. So please, as the discussion is going on, make your opinion known. You have a right to disagree, but it is your responsibility to make sure that other people know you disagree and they know why. Okay? If you're going to abstain, and that should be rare, the abstentions are called for after the no votes. But we beg the chair not to routinely ask for abstentions. There are instances that by law you must abstain. You might want to abstain because you missed the discussion. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to abstain from this vote. I was not in executive session for the tribunal appeal, so I'm not going to vote on that. But again, that's diffusing that surprises thing. You're letting everybody know, okay? There are instances where it might be a relative and you can't vote. And you just say, I'm prevented by law from voting on this one. But you let everybody know, okay? We good? All right. Executive session, I already mentioned. You have limited topics. You know what they are? Okay, so you're aware of what that is. You don't discuss anything else. When you say personnel, it doesn't mean you talk about Ms. McGillicuddy's high heels. There are specific things that can be addressed in executive session, okay? And you want to deal with that. When you are in executive session, I assume that you leave this room and go, okay, your discussion in executive session is less formal than it is out here. And I assume that when you address each other here or you address the person at the podium, you're probably using a handle. Miss so-and-so, Miss, okay, you do that. When you have your executive session, it's less formal, but it's still a meeting. The chair still needs to facilitate the discussion. People still need to speak in turn. As far as executive session is concerned, you make the motion, you indicate what you're going to discuss, and you go into executive session. The vote takes place in public. The vote then becomes public. But, ladies and gentlemen, what is discussed in executive session is confidential. It is never to be brought out into the public. You don't talk about who said what, how they said it, who pounded the table, who was using cuss words. None of that comes out of executive session. Remember that trust we talked about? That is a foundation for your ability to work together for the benefit of the students. It's not about you. It's about the students. So don't breach that confidentiality so that you can continue to work well and work effectively together. Am I making sense? Okay. When you end executive session, you do adjourn the executive session, and that's what the minutes really deal with, that you went into executive session, who made that motion, who seconded it, what the vote was, what the topic was, and that you came back out. Sometimes you come out of executive session and there isn't a vote. You don't have anything to vote about. That's okay. But you go on with the rest of the meeting. Is your executive session at the beginning or the end? Okay, okay. All right. Any questions about executive session? Remember what I said. They'll know by the time you get to the parking lot that somebody breached it, and they'll know who it was. So let's be careful about that. I already mentioned the minutes. Anybody have any questions about the minutes? Okay. Okay. Just briefly, I did have a video for you, but we're not able to get it to work. It's a video about a meeting. I wanted you to see that and so we could talk about it. But just let me say that as far as meeting decorum is concerned, please be aware of your body language. And I'm going to ask you to access one of your meetings that has already taken place. When you do that, because everybody has access to, right? When you do that, don't do what we normally do. You know, we'll go to church and we'll say, oh, I wish so-and-so was here. She need to hear this sermon. I want you to look at yourself. Look at yourself, focus on self, and see what it is that you're doing during the meeting that could be improved. What are you doing that works well? What is your body language like? Do you look like you're open to discussion? Are you nodding? Are you asleep? Those things are very, very important. Remember that during the meeting, what your chairman has is, I don't know if you literally have one, but figuratively, a gavel, right? You've got one. All right. Okay. Okay. That is a gavel. It is not a scepter. The chairman is not in charge of anything. And sometimes people vie to be chair. What comes with the chairmanship is not authority, it's responsibility. He attends more meetings than anybody else. The focus of the media oftentimes is on the chair, unless there's one person who voted no. But he has a lot more responsibility, and that's why I really encourage you to review that job description with the board, sometimes when you can, but at retreat. The chairman can also be wrong sometimes, and there should be an opportunity to appeal the ruling of the chair with validity, okay? So it doesn't become a fight, but an opportunity. Just recognize that when things are going on, you want to make sure that you are hearing what's happening. Who takes the minutes? From right there?
Our secretary's executive assistant.
Okay. The board needs to agree and just give a green light that if something occurs and she misses something, she needs to have the opportunity to say, excuse me, who made that motion, or whatever it might be. Maybe she sneezed, maybe she left the room. But the other thing is, this should not be the person that the board is asking to get a bottle of water or any of those things. Sometimes that happens. She needs to be able to focus on the meeting. Those minutes become the official record of your meeting. And I believe that the law says they're kept forever. Something from the Georgia retention something. It says that they keep them a long time. So you want to be careful about your minutes, that she can get the information right. And also, that's another reason why you want to be careful about the acronyms. 10 years from now, some of the acronyms that we're using right now will be meaningless. So your minutes need to spell that out, and then someplace in parentheses, they would have the acronym. I think that I have covered. Okay, do you have any questions about the meeting? Okay, no questions about the meeting. You have a question about something else? Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk about best practices in regards to two different topics? So one, superintendent evaluation, and then also electing chair and vice chair.
Okay, I can do that. There's a whole workshop that goes on both of those, so I'm going to be succinct because I know y'all want to get out here and the clock is right there flashing. Okay, when the superintendent's evaluation comes up, all board members who participate in the evaluation must be trained on the instrument that you utilize. I don't know which instrument you utilize here. The law does not specify any one instrument that must be utilized, but that training also is not, it's not specified as to who must conduct the training. You don't have to pay somebody. Anybody can conduct the training who knows what the heck they're doing. The main thing to get across is the rankings, the ratings. What do they mean? And there needs to be some uniformity in understanding. If it's 1 to 5, for example, what does a 1 mean? So that you don't have a person who says, no, I'm not going to give the superintendent a 5 on that. Yes, he did a great job, but that's his job. I'm going to give him a 3. Everybody needs to have a similar understanding of how that goes. Typically, board members get the instrument, they work on the instrument individually, and the instrument and the goals that are set up there are based upon discussion with the superintendent. It is a collaborative effort. The board does not hand a document to the superintendent and says, this is what you will do. It is collaborative. There should be a stretch in the goals that are given to the superintendent, but they should not be insurmountable. We also suggest that there not be 145 goals. It's not going to happen. 3 to 5 areas of concentration that the superintendent agrees to. The board is required to do the evaluation annually, but to meet with the superintendent in between those times allows him to describe to you what the progress is, what's not going to happen. Then you can tweak some of those goals so that they make sense. You are not trying to cut your superintendent off at the knees. His success is your success, so you want to help him to be successful. He needs to know if he is meeting your expectations along the way, that kind of thing, okay? The board does them individually. You come together, you discuss your individual ratings, and you come to some consensus as to what the compilation is going to be. Some boards then have the board chair to meet with the superintendent to go over what the board has discussed. Some boards do that with all of them. The superintendent has 10 business days to respond to that evaluation in writing, and whatever his response is attached to that document. At that time, you begin to plot the goals for the next year. I think that's right. That's the Cliff's Notes version. Does that help you? Okay. But the essential part is that all board members must be trained on the instrument. So if you decide to change the instrument you've been using, all board members would need to participate in that. The training could come from an administrator. It could come from the board attorney. You don't have to pay someone to come in and do that training. Okay? Yes. I'll come back. I got you another one.
Are you finished?
I finished with that. Go ahead.
How should the board be made aware of the curriculum where there is a relevance factor versus a non-relevance factor? Because as you mentioned earlier, education is changing. What was taught 50 years ago, a lot of it's not relevant today, or the method is not relevant today. Could you expound on that from your experience?
Just from my experience, I would say this. Periodically, the superintendent is going to identify individuals who will come forward to the board and talk about what's going on as far as curriculum is concerned. That is probably going to be relevant to newer programs or those that the superintendent and his staff feel need to be phased out. If there is a particular question that a board member has about something in the curriculum, something they heard from a neighbor or whatever, they submit that to the superintendent so that he can investigate and get that information back. I don't know that there is a particular calendar. Your superintendent may have one, but I think that generically that's the way it goes. Is that right, Mr. Superintendent? Okay. Does that answer your question?
Not exactly.
Okay.
Should the board even have input into what is relevant in the curriculum?
The board is not expected to be education experts. And therefore, I would be wary of telling the superintendent what's relevant or not. If I'd heard something, I'd make the superintendent aware. Remember, I said earlier that you are the liaison to the community. So if something has been brought to your attention, you pass that on to the superintendent. But I'm not sure that anyone on the board is of the ilk where they could determine what's relevant and what's not.
Kind of what I'm thinking about is, we have what we call CTLS, and it's
What
a
is that?
Cobb Teaching and Learning System.
Okay.
We could probably spend another hour talking about what it really is, but Ms. Lawson and her staff are in charge of that. And a lot of it is that you're not necessarily using a textbook, but you're creating a textbook collaborative with, say, world history. All the world histories are on the same page. If you go theoretically, if you go from one class to the next class, you're hearing the same thing. You're learning the same thing. What I'm thinking is that how does a board know that we're providing the level of education compared to maybe other states, other countries, based on our curriculum? How do we know that?
You know it based upon the fact that you have hired education experts who don't stay in a cocoon. They attend meetings, they get professional development, they interact with other people through their professional societies. You depend upon them to keep up with what's going on. And besides that, they are accountable to the state that has certain requirements relevant to curriculum. Isn't that correct? And that's going to be the extent to which I can answer that because I'm not an educator. But does that help at all? Okay, let me finish. Ms. Davis, you had a second question. I did not get to that. You asked about the election of the board chair. Every district is a little bit different. There are some districts wherein the board chair is elected district-wide by the public. And so that's just that. When that happens, the danger is in a person being elected as board chair and they're new to the board. It takes about 2 years to get your feet wet as a new board member, to really have a sense of what you're doing. But typically in the state of Georgia, the election of the board chair takes place at the January meeting. And so the board would talk about, who is interested in serving as board chair. Now, some boards rotate the responsibility. And I mean, they absolutely rotate it, District 1, District 2, et cetera. If they ask me, I'd say absolutely not. I do not believe that every member of the school board has the skill set necessary to be an effective board chair. There are a lot of balls to juggle at one time. So the board at that meeting would elect the chairman. Lots of times they'll ask the superintendent to run that portion of the meeting, the election. The election is done publicly, is not done by secret ballot. And it's a majority vote. So if a person is interested in being board chair, they need to not make it a surprise. You want to let people know so you might be able to garner their vote. The person is elected at the January meeting typically, and they immediately assume that post as chair. The election of vice chair is the same kind of thing, and typically for school boards, we use and look to the vice chair position as a placeholder. It is not. The vice chair needs to have the same set of skills as the chair, because in the absence of the chair, that is the person who facilitates the meeting, and note that I said facilitates the meeting, not runs the meeting, and who is the spokesperson for the district, for the school board, as authorized by the board by board action. I left something out, didn't I?
Would you recommend putting someone in that vice chair position that is new with the idea that they would be more prepared for the chair position at some later date?
Well, it just depends. Every board is different. I have seen the election of the board chair where a new board member was elected board chair by the board. So it just depends. Sometimes it has to do with the skills that the person brings, their experience otherwise, but every board is different. You are basically autonomous. You figure it out and do what works. But the main thing is to develop that sense of team. I'm going to go back to where I started. The state has mandated that school boards have whole board governance team training, which includes the board and the superintendent, because you are expected to behave as a team, different from other elected bodies. You are expected to do what is best for children. You are expected to put your personal things aside. Vote your conviction based upon the information that is shared here at the table. So no board member should approach this board table saying, oh, I'm going to vote against that, or I'm going to vote in support of this until the discussion has taken place. I wish I could firmly answer that question for you. I cannot. Yes, sir.
I have one you hadn't touched on, but as I was thinking through, social media. Of course, when I was campaigning, I have a Facebook page. I have a personal Facebook page. I decided a long time ago, or not a long, but I decided at a point, I'm going to try and keep the politics off my personal Facebook page, but I'm friends with everybody. And then I've got my other thing that I haven't shut down, but now here's what I've noticed happens, and I don't know if GSBA had, I'll have somebody put a comment out there in a forum someplace about something, and then they tag me, trying to pull me in, and I try to avoid all this. So then there's a chance, oh, you're not engaging or whatever. So anyway, I'm just wondering if, has GSBA, or you personally, seen different things going on social media that you feel like need to be addressed, or that, these are things we didn't know 10, 12 years ago?
Social media can be horrendous. Everybody has an opinion and you're entitled to it. But remember what I said about if you didn't want it to be on a billboard, don't put it in writing? That includes social media. And the thing is that even when an individual does not say so, people in the community assume that you're speaking for the board. Even if you say, well, I'm not speaking as a board member, but you're a board member. That board hat never comes off. I would be extremely cautious. Yes, I have a Facebook page, but I am admonished constantly because I don't use it. Years ago, we were asked at GSBA to do Facebook because that is a tool for social media. But my daughters have to tell me if somebody's contacted me on social media, and then I'll tell them, here's my email address. It can get so dangerous. And the other thing is recognize that with social media, with texting, and with email, interpretation is always the risk. If I am speaking with you and I say something, there is a much better chance that we will communicate effectively. With social media, there is so much opportunity for misunderstanding, misinterpretation of the message. I personally stay away from it, but I would implore school board members not to use that as a platform relevant to school board business because there is so much opportunity for misinterpretation. You may have the best goals in mind, but somebody doesn't get it.
Question for the superintendent. Do we have SACS evaluation coming up this year?
Well, we'll be going through, we're actually the first district to go through a new accreditation method.
But that's this year.
That is coming up. So it will be for the 1920 school year. So it's this coming up school year, not this calendar year, but this coming up school year, we'll be going through that.
Okay. Could you go into a little bit of how the board would prepare for a SACS evaluation?
You prepare for the SACS evaluation by just being who you are. SACS is going to ask questions of board members about how you do certain things, how you conduct your board meetings, how you behave in the public, what is your understanding of various things. Don't try to be an expert with them if you're not. Don't try to talk to them about portions of curriculum that you really don't know. Talk to them about the things you know. They know that you're not education experts, but they will ask those things. They will also communicate with people in the community as to what they feel about the board. It doesn't have to be a scary prospect, I don't think. Just be who you are. If you've been messing up, it's going to come out.
Can I add to that as well?
Please.
At least the latest version of the online standards, I think they might call them indicators, they have about 30 approximately indicators that they will look for. They want to see evidence of progress or adherence to those indicators and standards. And all except for 2 of them relate to the school district and staff and those levels and what's going on in the schools. Only 2 of them relate to the board. One is basically, do you follow your policy? And the second is, do you follow your code of ethics, which is a policy. So, and then underneath that level, there's a lot of interpretation of that. And then I don't know much about the new process that's going to be used. I'm sure the superintendent's going to keep you posted, but that's just a big picture.
From the experiences I've had in the past, it's been a one-on-one with some representative from SACS. Is that still probably going to be the
I will update the board as we get more into the process. Again, we're the first district to go through the new accreditation process. So you'll be getting updates as we get into that process, but it's going to be totally different. Okay. Right.
Anything else? Okay, yes.
When you were talking about the board chair
I'm
and
sorry.
what the board chair, what he or she is or isn't, would it be safe to say, not in your words, but what I picked up on is the chair really doesn't have any more power. They're just a facilitator and a spokesperson when appropriate?
It would be safe to say the board chair has no power. Board members have no power, but the board
Yeah.
chair has no power. The board chair has 1 vote, and in some districts, the board chair doesn't have that. In some districts, by local policy, the board chair can only vote to break a tie. But generically, the board chair can make a motion, the board chair can second a motion, the board chair can vote. The chairman who is effective does not dominate the meeting by having control of the mic. But there is no power. There is responsibility as opposed to authority. And thank you for asking that again. It's an important thing to know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, I have one more thing that I want to share with the board, if there are not any other questions. Okay. I need you to listen to this, and I'm going to read this one. Yeah, he's scared I'm going to throw it at him. No. Okay. The relationship between the school board and the superintendent can be compared to that between a baseball pitcher and the catcher. The catcher has responsibility for watching the entire field of play, for knowing all the players on the opposing team who come up to bat. The catcher advises the pitcher as to what kind of pitch would be best based on what the pitcher knows about the batter. The pitcher decides to accept the catcher's recommendation or to shake off that recommendation in favor of a different pitch. Once there is a decision between them, the pitcher throws the pitch and the catcher reacts accordingly. The superintendent is the catcher. But in this public education ball game, we're not trying to get any player out. The batters are public school students, and our goal is to make sure they all get home runs. First base is elementary school, second base middle school, third base high school, and home plate is high school graduation. Infield players are the staff members working in the schools. Outfield players are those in the central office and support staff, bus drivers and others, who work on behalf of the entire school district. The catcher, superintendent, observes everything and is aware of what students need for success. He makes recommendations to the pitcher, that's the school board, about what pitch, and that's your vote, the budget, the policy, is necessary to move the school district forward. The school board ultimately votes the way it chooses, that's throwing the pitch, and the superintendent responds to the pitch by implementing appropriate action. Hopefully, the decision or pitch will result in students getting around all the bases and across home plate to graduation, as well as giving those in the field what they need in order to do their jobs according to the expectations, the goals and objectives in the strategic plan. When necessary, the catcher and pitcher meet on the mound for private conversation. Guess what that is? That's the executive session. And what's discussed on the pitcher's mound stays on the mound. Now, this may not be a perfect analogy for the board-superintendent relationship, but it may help define how that relationship can be effective. Now, since the board is a singular entity with multiple components, we might think of the board vote like the hand holding a baseball. Now, this is a 5-member board because I don't have but 5 fingers, okay? So if there's a 5-member board and only 3 members vote to support a recommendation, consider a ball held by 3 fingers in preparation for the pitch. Notice that all fingers on the hand go with the pitch even if they aren't touching the ball. When action is taken, the school board speaks with one voice, even if the vote isn't unanimous. Once again, I cannot give credit to the person from whom I stole this. Didn't write it down. It was somebody in another state, but I think it works. And I do hope it will work for you and for your team. I'm done.
Yes. And then we'll give you credit.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to come help us to think through some things and learn some things that are new and put things in perspective.
We have a photo op, Mr. Chair, with the picture. You would catch the.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't want to be responsible for, what's that? Oh, yeah, we need to do our critiques. All right. So thank you so much. Now, we will do our critiques, and I need to have a motion that we move into executive session to discuss a student appeal.
I move that we go to executive session. for our
Thank you, Ms.
appeal. Yes.
Davis. Dr. Howard provided a second. Okay, all those in favor, please raise your hand. And that is everyone. Any opposed? No, so that's 7-0. All right, so we will be in executive session. I don't know how long. We'll reconvene afterwards for a short vote.